What do we do with an object that refuses to stay in its century? History, we like to imagine, moves in a straight line. A spark becomes a flame. A tool becomes a machine. One age hands its knowledge to the next, and civilization climbs forward step by careful step. It is a reassuring story. It gives order to time. It tells us that the past is settled, that the dead have said what they had to say, and that we, standing here in the bright noise of the present, understand more than those who came before us. But now and then, something surfaces from the ground or the sea that disturbs that comfort. A corroded mechanism hauled from a wreck, a stone cut with astonishing precision, a vessel, small enough to fit in one hand, that seems to whisper of electricity long before the modern world gave it a name. These are not merely curiosities. They are interruptions. They ask whether knowledge is as permanent as we think, or whether whole chapters of human ingenuity can vanish so completely that later generations mistake them for impossibilities. This is not a story about proving hidden empires or secret masters of history. It is something quieter and perhaps more unsettling. It is about the limits of certainty, about the way memory fails not only in people, but in cultures, about how a civilization can build, discover, refine, and still lose what it once knew. Across deserts, shipwrecks, mines, and ruined temples, we find traces that do not fit neatly into the timeline we inherited. Some may have ordinary explanations, some may be misunderstood, and some remain suspended in that uneasy space between evidence and interpretation, where humility matters more than confidence, because the deeper question is not whether the past was stranger than we imagined. It is whether we are brave enough to admit that history may be less like a ladder and more like a coastline seen through fog. What if the first crack in our timeline began at the bottom of the sea? In the spring of 1900, sponge divers working near the Greek island of Antikythera descended into water so clear it must have seemed almost merciful. Then, as they drifted deeper, shapes emerged from the silence. Bronze limbs, shattered marble faces, the ghostly remains of a Roman-era shipwreck resting on the seafloor. It was a graveyard of beauty, the kind of discovery that already feels larger than language. But buried among statues and coins was something less elegant, and in time far more astonishing. At first it looked like little more than a lump of corroded bronze and wood, broken, mineralized, easy to overlook. Yet when scholars began to examine the fragments, tiny gears appeared inside the ruin, packed with a delicacy no one expected from the ancient world. Teeth meshed with teeth, wheels turned other wheels. The object was not decorative, it was thinking. What emerged over decades of study was a machine unlike anything anyone believed the Greeks had built. It could track celestial cycles, predict eclipses, and model the motions of the heavens with a sophistication that felt centuries ahead of its time. Not a simple tool, but a kind of analog computer, an instrument made by hands that understood mathematics not only in theory, but in metal. And that is where the unease begins. If such knowledge existed, where did it go? Why did a technology so refined leave behind no industrial lineage, no obvious family of descendants leading into the medieval or modern world? Perhaps it was rare. Perhaps it belonged to a narrow circle of experts. Perhaps history, which preserves empires and loses workshops, simply forgot the people who knew how to build it. The Antikythera Mechanism does not tell us the ancient world was magical. It tells us something more human, that intelligence can bloom brightly and locally, then disappear. That progress is not always a road. Sometimes it is a flare in the dark, visible for a moment, then gone, leaving us to wonder how many other lights were lost before anyone thought to name them. Could a small clay jar hold a question larger than an empire? Imagine a work table in the ancient world. Dust in the air, a narrow vessel of baked earth no taller than a hand. Inside it, a copper cylinder, an iron rod, traces of something acidic once sealed away. At first glance, it is ordinary, almost humble, the kind of object history would pass without ceremony. And yet, this modest container has unsettled generations of scholars because it seems to gesture toward an idea we thought belonged to a much later age: stored electrical energy. The artifact, often called the Baghdad Battery, was unearthed near the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, in a landscape already crowded with the memory of kingdoms. When modern investigators recreated its design and filled it with a weak acidic liquid, the vessel produced a small current. Not much. Just enough to complicate the story, enough to make people wonder whether ancient craftsmen had discovered a practical effect without leaving behind the language we would use to describe it. That possibility matters. Human beings often learn by doing long before they understand by theory. A sailor can read the wind without naming the physics. A metal worker can master heat without writing chemistry. It is possible that some forgotten artisan noticed what happened when certain materials met in a confined space and turned that observation into a tool. For ritual, for plating metals, for experiment. The truth is less settled than the arguments around it. And maybe that is the point. Not every mystery demands a grand solution. Some ask for something harder. Restraint. The jar does not prove an ancient electric age. It does, however, remind us that discovery is not always linear, and that useful knowledge can appear quietly, live briefly, and vanish before the world understands what it has seen. How many first steps in human history were taken, then forgotten, because no one realized they were the beginning of something? How do you carve certainty into stone when the tools in your hands should not be enough? In Egypt, the sunlight falls hard on granite, exposing every surface without mercy. It reveals what the centuries have not erased. Drilled holes, cylindrical cores, smooth inner walls, marks cut into some of the hardest stone on earth with a confidence that still feels modern. These are not grand monuments from a distance. They are small technical traces. And because they are technical, they are difficult to romanticize away. Granite is stubborn material. It resists pressure, blunts metal, exposes weakness in both hand and method. Yet some ancient drill holes appear astonishingly regular, as if made with steady force and unbroken alignment. The grooves spiral with a rhythm that suggests consistency rather than improvisation. Engineers who study such details do not hear legend in them. They hear process, repetition, control. That is where the mystery deepens. Traditional explanations point to patience, abrasives, and remarkable labor. Perhaps that is true, at least in part. Human beings have always done difficult things with simple tools. But certain marks seem to ask for more than endurance. They suggest a sophistication of technique, a refined understanding of pressure, speed, and material behavior that feels uncomfortably close to machinery, even if machinery is the very thing we are reluctant to imagine. What survives in stone is not the workshop, only the result. The drills are gone, the hands are gone, the noise of cutting, the corrections, the failed attempts, gone. We are left with the silence after workmanship, and silence can be deceptive. It can make skill look impossible simply because the knowledge behind it has vanished. Maybe that is why these marks matter so much. They remind us that mastery often outlives explanation. A finished object can remain while the culture of making it disappears entirely. And when that happens, the past begins to look less like a primitive beginning and more like a conversation interrupted in the middle of a sentence. So the question is not only how they drilled the stone, it is how much human expertise can disappear before later generations stop recognizing it as expertise at all. What if the oldest map of the world was really a map of memory? In 1929, a fragment of animal skin covered in ink began to trouble the modern imagination. It was part of a chart attributed to the Ottoman admiral Piri Reis, a man of the 16th century who gathered older sources, copied coastlines, and stitched inherited knowledge into a new image of the world. On its surface, the map belongs to the age of sail, to the restless years when shorelines were becoming currency and oceans were slowly surrendering their secrets. But one portion of it has inspired a much deeper unease. Some viewers believe the map showed lands far beyond what sailors of its era should have known in such detail. A stretch of southern coastline, drawn in a way that seemed strangely out of time, invited comparisons to places that had not yet entered the accepted record of exploration. Was this evidence of lost voyages, forgotten charts, ancient geographic knowledge handed down through copies of copies until the originals disappeared? Maybe, or maybe not. Maps are never simple mirrors of the earth. They are blends of fact, error, ambition, rumor, and hope. They compress many voices into one image. A coastline may shift because the draftsman guessed because the source was damaged, or because old information was forced to fit a new worldview. To look at any map is to look not only at geography, but at interpretation. What we see there often says as much about our hunger for certainty as it does about the lines themselves. And yet the fascination remains because the Piri Reis Map feels like a message passed through many hands. Even if the most dramatic claims around it are overstated, it still points to something deeply human. Knowledge travels in fragments. Sailors inherit observations from sailors. Empires borrow from the people they conquer. A chart may contain not one discovery, but the layered sediment of many forgotten journeys. So perhaps the real mystery is not whether the map proves the impossible. Perhaps it is whether anything humans know is ever entirely original, or whether all knowledge is, in some quiet way, a coastline redrawn from memory. Can absence leave a mark as powerful as anything we find? Across deserts and buried strata, archaeologists sometimes encounter not a treasure, but a silence that feels misplaced. Layers of earth hold bones, tools, pottery, ash. They preserve the small signatures of ordinary life with surprising loyalty. And yet there are moments when the sequence seems to falter. An object appears too early, a technique seems to arrive without visible rehearsal, a material enters the record with a confidence that suggests a longer, forgotten prelude. These are not always dramatic discoveries. Often they are subtle disruptions. But subtlety can be more unsettling than spectacle. Consider iron. In many parts of the ancient world, it did not simply replace earlier metals overnight. It appeared unevenly, sometimes rarely, sometimes in forms that seemed ceremonial or anomalous before becoming ordinary. A bead here, a blade there, a fragment suggesting knowledge before knowledge was supposed to be widespread. Historians wisely resist turning every anomaly into revolution, but they also know that surviving evidence is not the same as complete evidence. Human history is less an archive than a shoreline after a storm, scattered with what happened to endure. That fragility changes how we should look at the past. We tend to imagine invention as a public event, widely seen and steadily adopted. In reality, much of it may begin in isolation. A workshop, a village, a single gifted craftsperson solving a problem for reasons no chronicler thought worth recording. If the chain breaks there, the discovery does not enter history. It dissolves into local memory, then into nothing. What remains may look like an impossibility only because the middle chapters are gone. This is one of the hardest lessons buried in ancient objects. The record is not neutral. It is shaped by fire, flood, conquest, neglect, and accident. What survived is not necessarily what mattered most, only what was lucky enough to outlast oblivion. So when we find something that seems to arrive before its time, perhaps the first question is not whether history is wrong. Perhaps it is whether history, like memory itself, has always been built around beautiful and irreparable gaps. What if the most unsettling objects are the ones that resemble us too closely? In the deep folds of time, there are moments when stone seems to forget it is only stone. A figure emerges with proportions that feel observant rather than decorative. A face carries intention. A body is shaped with such sensitivity that it appears less like an idol and more like a memory of a living person. Across different ancient cultures, certain carvings and sculptures have provoked this quiet astonishment. Not because they are impossible, but because they feel psychologically familiar in ways we do not expect from worlds so far removed from our own. We often speak of early art as if it were a prelude, a necessary first attempt before realism, depth, and subtlety arrived. Yet some ancient works resist that tidy hierarchy. They reveal anatomical awareness, emotional restraint, and an eye for presence that seems to collapse time. The artists who made them were not stumbling towards sophistication. They were already in conversation with it. They understood that to shape a face is not merely to copy features, but to suggest inner life. That recognition can be disorienting. It asks us to reconsider what we mean when we call the past primitive. Too often, that word says more about our assumptions than about ancient people. Technical tools may differ. Materials may be scarce. Methods may be lost to us. But perception, the human capacity to notice, to imagine, to translate experience into form, has always run deeper than the timelines we build around it. Perhaps that is why these works endure so powerfully. They do not just show us what ancient people made. They show us what ancient people saw. Their attention moves across the centuries and meets our own. In the curve of a mouth, the tilt of a head, the measured stillness of a carved body, we recognize something that technology cannot fully explain: the continuity of human feeling. And maybe that is one of history's most humbling truths. The past does not become mysterious only when it seems advanced. It becomes mysterious whenever it reminds us that people long gone were already as inward, observant, and profoundly human as we are now. What if a footprint could outlast the story that made it? In a layer of rock laid down so long ago that the mind can barely hold the number, a shape appears that seems almost intimate, the outline of a human sandal pressed into ancient stone. Nearby, perhaps, a mark that resembles the tread of something manufactured, or a groove in fossil-bearing strata that feels less geological than deliberate. These are the kinds of finds that ignite the imagination because they do not arrive with certainty. They arrive with resemblance. And resemblance, in matters of deep time, is both powerful and dangerous. Some call such traces impossible. Others call them misreadings. In many cases, the debate turns not on fraud or fantasy, but on pattern recognition itself. Human beings are exquisitely tuned to see familiar forms in the world. We find faces in clouds, intent in shadows, meaning in broken lines. That instinct has helped us survive, create, and remember. It also makes us vulnerable to seeing design where there is only accident, and chronology where there is only coincidence. Yet even when such markings fail to prove what first inspired them, they reveal something important about our relationship with the past. We are not only searching for facts, we are searching for contact. A footprint, real or misinterpreted, affects us because it suggests presence. It narrows the impossible distance between our bodies and vanished worlds. It tells us, or seems to tell us, that someone once stood here. Someone bore weight, moved forward, left a sign no language was needed to understand. That longing matters. It is part of why ancient objects grip us so deeply. We want history not merely as information, but as nearness. We want to feel the past under our feet, not just in our books. And sometimes that desire can run ahead of the evidence. So the lesson of these strange impressions may not be that humans walked where they should not have walked. It may be that the deeper hunger behind such claims is the wish to believe time is thinner than it looks, that between the living and the long departed, a single mark in stone might still be enough to bridge the silence. What if the Earth remembers heat that history never learned how to name? Deep underground, in places where stone holds the pressure of ages, miners and geologists have sometimes found something that feels almost like an after-image of violence. Glassy formations, fused surfaces, rock transformed by temperatures so extreme they seem to belong to industry, weaponry, or a catastrophe. Yet some of these materials appear in layers far older than any furnace, far earlier than any machine we would place in the human story. Their existence does not always signal mystery. Nature can generate astonishing forces. Lightning can vitrify sand. Meteor impacts can rewrite whole landscapes in a moment of fire. Volcanic heat can alter the earth with terrifying elegance. And still, the sight of melted stone unsettles us. Part of that unease comes from recognition. We know what intense heat does because we have learned to make it ourselves. We see glassy surfaces and think of kilns, engines, explosions, cities remade by technology. So when ancient ground bears similar signatures, the mind reaches instinctively toward hidden civilizations or forgotten wars. Sometimes those interpretations say less about the evidence than about the age we live in, an age so shaped by a manufactured power that we hardly struggle to imagine nature as equally dramatic. But the deeper fascination lies elsewhere. These strange materials remind us that history is not separate from the planet that carries it. Human timelines are written inside a world capable of immense and indifferent transformation. A single strike from the sky, a burst of geological force, a season of fire beyond any witness, all can leave behind traces that later generations misread as intention. The Earth, too, can produce artifacts of astonishment, and yet our misreadings are revealing. They show how quickly we search for ourselves in every anomaly. We want the mark in the stone to be human because that would make the mystery familiar. It would place us back at the center. Perhaps wisdom begins when we resist that urge, because not every impossible object is evidence of lost human power. Some are reminders that we have always lived inside a universe more inventive than our explanations, and that humility may be the first tool we need when the ground seems to remember something we do not. What if the most revealing discovery is not the object itself, but the argument it leaves behind? By the time an artifact enters public imagination, it has already lived several lives. First, as a thing in the world, used, buried, lost, then as a recovery, lifted from soil, sea, or stone into human hands, and finally as a story shaped by scholars, skeptics, journalists, collectors, and dreamers. Somewhere in that final transformation, the object becomes larger than its material form. It becomes a mirror for our anxieties about knowledge, authority, and truth. This is why so many disputed finds generate more heat than light. A single fragment can divide observers into camps that seem to be arguing about evidence, when they are also arguing about trust. Who gets to decide what counts as real? How much uncertainty can a culture tolerate before it rushes to defend the familiar? Every era believes it is rational, and every era has its blind spots. The challenge is not to reject expertise, but to remember that expertise is strongest when it remains open to revision. At the same time, openness is not the same as surrendering to every dramatic claim. Mystery deserves discipline. Evidence must be weighed, context examined, alternatives considered. Otherwise, wonder curdles into fantasy, and the past becomes merely a screen onto which we project our desires. The task is harder and more interesting than that. It asks us to stay in the tension between imagination and restraint, to let an object remain strange without forcing it to confess more than it knows. In that sense, controversial artifacts tell us as much about the present as the past. They reveal how hungry we are for disruption, but also how deeply we fear it. We say we want discovery, yet often only on terms that leave our worldview intact. Anything else feels like a threat, but maybe it is not a threat. Maybe the finest role of mystery is not to overthrow history, but to soften our certainty, to remind us that truth is often approached through patience, and that wisdom begins the moment we stop needing the world to be simpler than it is. What if some inventions do not disappear because they fail, but because the world around them does? Picture a workshop lit by oil and afternoon dust. A craftsperson bends over a table, refining a method that few others understand. The technique works. It solves a problem. It may even inspire awe in the people who see it. And yet outside that room, empires shift, trade routes fracture, patrons die, languages drift, libraries burn. What was once possible becomes difficult to sustain. What was once taught becomes local, then rare, then gone. We often imagine lost knowledge as something dramatic, a vault of secrets sealed away from history. More often, streaming interrupted, waiting for the complete message. What if the objects we call impossible are really evidence of a simpler truth, that forgetting is one of history's greatest forces? We tend to imagine loss as dramatic. A library burns, a city falls, an empire collapses under the weight of war, drought, or disease, and certainly history contains those visible endings. But much of what disappears vanishes more quietly. A master craftsperson dies without an apprentice. A workshop closes. A technique survives in the hands of a few, then in the memory of one, and then nowhere at all. No flames, no monument, only absence spreading gently through time. Seen this way, many ancient anomalies feel less like violations of chronology and more like survivors of a broader ruin. A mechanism too advanced for its age. A polished stone surface that implies vanished precision. A map built from sources we no longer possess. None of these need to point toward fantasy. They may simply testify to the fragility of transmission. What a culture knows is never guaranteed to remain known. Knowledge is not a monument, it is a chain, and chains break. That thought should sound familiar to us now. Even in the modern world, surrounded by servers and satellites, we are not beyond forgetting. We preserve more than any civilization before us, yet we also depend on systems so complex that few individuals understand them completely. Our confidence in permanence may prove as temporary as anyone else's. The future might inherit our artifacts and still misunderstand the world that made them. This is why ancient mysteries matter beyond their details. They are not only puzzles of archaeology, They are meditations on continuity, on how much must be repeated, taught, and cherished for a human insight to survive the passing of generations, and on how easily brilliance can slip beneath the threshold of memory if no one keeps speaking its name. Perhaps the past is not filled with impossible objects because our ancestors were magical. Perhaps it is filled with them because forgetting is ordinary, and remembrance, careful, patient, imperfect remembrance, is one of the rarest achievements any civilization ever manages. What, then, are we really looking for when we search the past for what should not be there? By this point in the journey, the objects themselves begin to blur into something larger. A machine recovered from the sea, a jar that hints at forgotten experiment, stones shaped with unnerving precision, maps, markings, traces that seem to arrive ahead of their appointed hour. Each one opens a door, but none leads to a final chamber where all mysteries are solved. Instead, they return us to the same quiet threshold, the limit of what human beings can truly know about lives no longer able to speak for themselves. And yet we keep asking. Not because we are foolish, but because something in us resists the idea that the past is closed. We sense, perhaps correctly, that history is not a completed book. It is a damaged manuscript, pages missing, margins burned, whole chapters washed out by time. When an artifact seems out of place, it does more than challenge a timeline. It awakens the ache of incompleteness. It reminds us that our picture of human experience is partial, assembled, provisional. There is dignity in admitting that. In a culture trained to reward certainty, uncertainty can feel like weakness. But in the presence of deep time, certainty is often the least honest posture available. Better to be careful. Better to let evidence speak slowly. Better to recognize that mystery is not the opposite of knowledge, but one of its conditions. We learn because something resists us. We study because something remains unresolved. Perhaps that is why these objects endure so vividly in the imagination. They allow us to feel both small and connected. Small because the world is older and more intricate than our explanations. Connected because the people who made, used, lost, or left behind these things were driven by recognizably human impulses: curiosity, necessity, craft, hope, survival. And that may be the truest revelation before the story closes. Not that the past was populated by impossibilities, but that it was populated by people, resourceful, intelligent, fallible people, whose lives still reach toward us through fragments, asking whether we are willing to meet mystery with humility rather than fear. In the end, the question was never only about objects. It was about time itself, about the stories we build to make time feel orderly, and the small, stubborn artifacts that remind us it is anything but. We began with things that seemed misplaced, mechanisms too refined, marks too precise, fragments too suggestive, traces that unsettled the neat sequence we inherited. Some of them may one day be explained completely. Some may remain contested. A few may turn out to be less extraordinary than they first appeared, but even then their deeper value will endure, because their true power lies in what they ask of us. They ask us to look at history not as a triumphal march, but as a living field of partial memory. They ask us to accept that discovery does not always survive, that knowledge can flare brightly and then disappear, that whole traditions of skill may sink beneath the surface of time without leaving more than a few scattered signs. They ask us, too, to hold wonder and discipline together, to remain open without becoming credulous, skeptical without becoming closed. And perhaps most of all, they ask us to reconsider our relationship with those who came before us. The ancient world is often framed as distant, dim, incomplete, yet the farther we look, the more familiar it becomes. Behind every mechanism, vessel, carving, or map, there was a human presence, someone experimenting, measuring, shaping, repairing, observing the stars, reading the land, trying to preserve a piece of understanding against the erosion of the unknown. Their tools were different. Their world was different. Their longing to make sense of existence was not. That is why these mysteries remain with us. Not because they prove the past was magical, but because they reveal how fragile and beautiful human knowing has always been. We inherit more than facts from history. We inherit unfinished questions, and maybe that is the most honest ending we can offer. That truth is rarely a monument standing untouched in the sun. More often, it is a fragment lifted carefully from darkness, weathered, incomplete, still carrying the warmth of the hands that once made it, and waiting for us to decide how gently, how wisely, and how humbly we are willing to hold it.